All right, why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to a special installment of Center for Latin American Studies Current Events Series. I'm Ben Lessing, Director of the Center, and today it's my pleasure to welcome Jose Marinero, who's going to be talking on a set of topics that I know I'm personally very interested to learn more about, El Salvador and its President Nayib Bukele, and some of the recent developments that Bukele has and changes Bukele has brought about. And what we can expect moving forward. I'm going to introduce Jose in just a second, but a couple of logistical notes about today's event and a couple of notes about upcoming Center for Latin American Studies events. We have next week, next Wednesday, the third installment in our series on the outlook for Brazilian democracy in 2022. And in this third installment, we're going to be looking at armed threats to Brazilian democracy. This is an event that I'm also very excited about, with 4 of Brazil's top experts on issues related to armed militias, armed militant civilian groups, and civilian gun ownership, police activism, police politicization of the police, and the armed forces. So please join us next Wednesday at this same time for an important event on Brazil. You can see in the chat, Natalie has posted the link to the registration for that event. We also have upcoming on March 2nd, our visiting Tinker Fellow, Pablo Andres Neumeier, will be lecturing on the heterogeneous epidemiological and economic impacts of COVID-19 in Bogota. We're always very happy to welcome our Tinker scholars who spend a quarter in residence and always provide at least one public lecture. So please don't miss Pablo Neumeier's presentation next March 2nd. Okay, for today's talk, I just want to point out a couple of logistical items. One is that this webinar format that we've been using, it has the limitation that you can't see each other. You can just see the panelists. And so one thing I'd like to invite everyone to do is just say their names and where they're watching from in the chat. It creates a little bit more community, and just kind of a nice way to know who's all here. I hope that makes up a little bit for the strangeness of the format. I also want to point out the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use this to make to ask questions, which we will be after Jose's presentation, I'll be asking him questions from the Q&A list. You can both make questions, and you can also upvote questions that you like by clicking on the thumbs up next to individual questions there. So looking forward to getting some interesting and probing questions from the audience. With no further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Jose Marinero to class's current events series. Jose is a Salvadoran attorney and lecturer specializing in administrative law and public policy with an emphasis on the rule of law. For over 20 years, he's worked at the intersection of public law and policy, serving as a consultant, researcher, and public servant. He obtained his law degree in El Salvador, pursued graduate studies in constitutional law at the University of Salamanca in Spain, and he later earned a master in public policy degree from my own alma mater, University of California, Berkeley. As well as an MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School. Besides lecturing at the graduate school of the Universidad Centroamericana José Simeón Cañas in San Salvador, and being a founding partner of the Novus Estudios Legal law firm, he's a founding member and the current president of the Fundación Democracia, Transparencia y Justicia, DTJ, or DTJ, which is a civil society organization promoting the rule of law, democracy, and anti-corruption reform in El Salvador since 2011. And in this work, Jose has been the target of smear campaigns and state-sponsored cyber attacks, as have recently so many Salvadorian journalists and activists. So again, we're very glad and honored to have Jose here today to talk to us about the threats to democracy in El Salvador and what lays ahead. Jose, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. The pressure is mine, all mine. I really want to start off by thanking you, by thanking the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago for this invitation, for this kind invitation. I want to thank you especially for the invitation, and Natalie for helping put this event in place. I hope we can share some perspectives on what's happening in terms of democracy in El Salvador. I really find this particular invitation pretty stimulating, given the academic perspectives that I'm sure will arise from an audience that certainly will enrich this exchange. And I really want to stress this part of the exchange. I think I want to encourage starting from now, any questions, because this is meant to be an open exchange. So any questions you might have, I might have the answers, I might not, but I think it's important to understand also what your views are on what's happening right now in El Salvador. And I hope to share what are some of the key issues right now in a very panoramic view of the key challenges to democracy in El Salvador right now. I think I want to start off by acknowledging that the title of my talk this afternoon, I think already refers to the main argument, which is that El Salvador is already facing a variant of authoritarianism, which disguised as it may come in crypto and other populist language and forms, has already manifested itself as a frontal challenge to democracy in the country. I would say, and I'm not the only one saying this is probably the most important democratic crisis in 30 years since the civil war ended in El Salvador by the 1992 peace accords. So that's the gist of my talk, right? That this is a new variant of authoritarianism in El Salvador. But I don't want to dissuade you from listening into this panoramic view or review of the evidence on which I support this interpretation, this reading of what's happening in El Salvador. And hopefully at the end exchange some thoughts and queries on what might be some of the open challenges going ahead. I think to most foreign audiences, the early Bukele projected a well-cared anti-establishment image, wearing jeans and his baseball hat backwards, even in formal occasions, and playing on his image as a social media savvy, modern millennial leader. Of course, among an audience interested in what is going on in Latin America, and particularly in Latin American politics, this is clearly an oversimplification. But this is the image he wanted to project early on in international media, in the international setting. I think probably this image has stuck for a while in international media, and has particularly been relevant to push forward his Bitcoin adoption agenda in the last few months. I will get to that in a moment. But in general, I think in the last 6 to 7 months, El Salvador has made international headlines again for what seems a logical extension of this image of this modern tech savvy or social media savvy millennial president that he's groomed actually in the last 3 or 4 years. And those headlines, I think, have been centered around mostly around the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender, right? I think this move has caught the attention of not only of the established financial markets, but also of a broad crypto fan base alike. And the idea of adopting Bitcoin as legal tender in El Salvador rapidly escalated to the creation of the launching of a Bitcoin city in in the country, and also the apparent announcement of what will become the volcano crypto bonds. Bukele claims that the country's mining energy source, Bitcoin mining energy source, is or will be a dormant volcano. This is, by the way, let me use the slides. This is him during the United Nations General Assembly in 2019. Probably this image, you might have seen this image around. This is like the first president that took a selfie during his words at the General Assembly. This is the actual selfie, and this is him taking the selfie. This is the launching of the Bitcoin City project. You can see there the city, this render of the city. So this round thing is where the city is supposed to be, at the foothills of this volcano. Somehow it has snow on the top. El Salvador hasn't seen snow ever. That's him, his avatar during the launch. And there's like a lot of hype. There's been a lot of hype around the launching, not only of the Bitcoin adoption, but also the Bitcoin City and the whole Bitcoin culture around or surrounding this idea, which is being led primarily by Bukele himself. This is the volcano where the actual Bitcoin City is supposed to be located, or will be located. You can see there's no snow-capped top summit. But in reality, what has happened is that Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador has been what I call a hard gamble. In general, it was an unannounced, very unpopular in the beginning decision. He announced the launching of the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender in a Bitcoin conference in Miami in English, obviously not for the Salvadorian public. The law was sent to Congress, the bill was sent to Congress and enacted after only a 90-minute discussion by legislators. And I think most of all, this seems a personal project led by Bukele himself. He has invested public funding, $30 for anybody who downloads the official government-run crypto wallet. He himself has used national TV, live TV to help users download and use their crypto wallet. He has given military protection to the ATMs for the crypto, the government-run crypto wallet. He has used their diplomatic muscle of the country to entice crypto investors to come to El Salvador. He trades from his own phone. Apparently, there are reports that he has been trading from his own phone. Given that there is little transparency in how these funds are being used, we're not sure, but this is not a remote possibility that he's actually trading from his own phone. The Washington Post had a note the other day saying that Bukele is probably he's joking that Bukele trades naked, right, on his whim, basically. There's no regulation for this trading. We have no idea where exactly this is being transferred. We have no idea when and how, for sure, at least with hard evidence, where and how Bitcoins have been bought by the country. We don't know how many. Officially, there's a number, but there's no way to actually verify that number. And there's an involvement of his family too. His brothers have no post in government, but nevertheless, they are seen very visibly in the crypto initiative, mingling among investors and leading the conversation surrounding the Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador. Of course, there's been zero transparency on the risks, on the processes, on the results of what's been called a gamble has produced by this time. In general, the rollout was not only opposed because of mistrust from the general population, but in general, it was also, to say the least, very messy. The government-run wallet crashed all the time, didn't seem to transfer the funds that were supposed to be used to transfer remittances from the states, particularly to El Salvador. And there are hundreds of reported identity thefts using the crypto wallet. So clearly, the initiative was not targeted for a national or a domestic public. He goes on Twitter, on his Twitter account, constantly in English to interact with crypto fans and crypto investors. He's obviously catering to a different audience, to an international audience. As I will explain later, this might have an explanation in terms of the fiscal pressure his government is already feeling at this point in his third year of term. This is just him launching the crypto adoption idea or project in the Miami Bitcoin conference. As you can see, there's a lot of hype in the crypto community. He has basically said that the IMF is wrong in saying that Bitcoin hinders the economy, the stability of the economy of El Salvador, and the crypto community, of course, has gone berserk on this public exchange between the IMF and Bukele. I think this other quote I have there on the bottom of this slide is pretty telling. Not all the crypto community is behind him. This is Vitalik Buterin, as you may know. He's the founder, the creator of the second most important crypto coin, Ethereum, and he's saying that making Bitcoin mandatory for business and the ideals of freedom that are supposed to be so important in the crypto space. So this is what's happening in general in terms of Bitcoin, and this is the crypto hype going on right now. This is Bukele tweeting a meme against the IMF. Yeah, after the IMF urged El Salvador to remove Bitcoin as legal tender, his reply was only a meme, a Simpson-related meme saying that he's taking note and he's not going to change his decision. I've chosen two other tweets from his timeline, also showing how he's constantly catering to an international audience, very far from domestic adopters of the government-run crypto wallet. The resistance to Bitcoin probably also prompted some of the first demonstrations against the Bukele government. Not even the removal of the Supreme Court's constitutional chamber or constitutional court moved people to the streets or took people to the streets, but the opposition around the adoption of Bitcoin did prompt the first demonstrations, massive demonstrations in the city of San Salvador. You can see there two pictures of different demonstrations, different times, where some of the demonstrators were carrying signs directly aimed against the adoption of Bitcoin, and the complete and frontal rejection of the idea of Bitcoin adoption. This is a story that continues to the day. The support for Bitcoin in the domestic audience is still very low. There's a lot of opposition to it. Trust in Bitcoin on the left, you can see this is from a public survey report from Fundación, a very prestigious independent civil society organization, saying that essentially 70% of the population does not trust or trusts very little in Bitcoin. This is data from 2021. There's also on the right, you will see two different survey data from December 21 and December, I'm sorry, they're the other way around, but it's August 21 and December 2021, where you can see that the vast majority of the population, even those that support him, believe that Bitcoin should be voluntary and not compulsory. I think the graph is very telling, 97.5 against 1% in December 2021. So as you can see, the hype in international grounds has a very different story and narrative in the domestic forum. But enough of Bitcoin. I think we'll tie in with the story later on, but in general, I think it's important to underline that Bitcoin is only a part of the story, and it's very telling of how decisions are being made right now in El Salvador. This unannounced, unconsulted, compulsory, centered in him decision catered to an audience, a business audience that we have very little information of. And in general, I think it's a sign of how politics and policy are going in El Salvador, and explains also, I think illustrates very well the nature of this variant of authoritarianism that is going around in El Salvador. This variant of authoritarianism in El Salvador, I think it's quite important to underline that is centered around the figure of Bukele himself. These are actual pictures from his Twitter profile. This is pictures he's used for his own Twitter profile when he claimed to be the coolest dictator in the world. This on the right. And then I think he said he named himself the coolest emperor, I think it was at one point. But these are actual profile pictures from his Twitter account. So I've taken them from his Twitter account. And I think illustrate very well how the whole phenomena around the rise of authoritarianism in El Salvador is centered around the figure of Bukele. Of course, there's an explanation for Bukele, but right now you could capture everything that is happening in the country around his figure and his decisions. Let me give you just a quick overview. I don't pretend to oversimplify, but this might sound as an oversimplification of how we came to this point, and how we probably can explain at this point how Bukele became to be. As you might recall, the country came out of a 12-year civil war in the 80s that ended through a negotiated peace accords in 1992. The peace accords were relatively successful. They ended the armed conflict. They allowed the reform of the judiciary, the reform of the electoral rules. They allowed for the political participation of the former guerrilla, which went into election in 1994, and basically started off a path towards democratization in the country. A lot has happened, of course, in 30 years. There have been some backslips. There has been serious mistakes, and some of the accords were actually never fully implemented, some to this day even. And I think in general, the country, if you take into account what has happened this 30 years, is certainly better off than it was during those times. And we have learned a number of things in democracy in this very problematic and sui generis democracy of ours. I don't want to oversimplify, but let's fast forward to 2014, and you see this man on the lower left picture, Francisco Flores, the former president of El Salvador. He's charged in 2014 on corruption charges. He dies during the investigation, but this is like the first case in 2014 of a high-level former president official being accused of corruption in the country in a long time. 2 years later, that's the picture on the upper left. That's Antonio Saca, and not the next former president, is also charged for corruption. That same year, 2016, the man on the upper right picture, Mauricio Funes, is flees to Nicaragua and is soon charged with corruption charges and has now 5 arrest warrants on him for corruption and laundering crimes related to the time when he was president. And finally, the man on the lower right, that's Salvador Sánchez Serén, the incumbent when Bukele became the candidate for presidency. He's also in Nicaragua. He fled after there was word that he was going to be indicted for corruption charges as well. While the last case, which happened in July 2021, is probably more, or it's suspicious of political persecution as well. I think this quick summary of corruption in government at this level is very telling of how the parties that came out of the war, the main parties that political parties that came out of the war, neglected in general terms their voters, used power for their own benefit, alienated their own voters, seemed to neglect also important policy objectives during those 30 years. And this, of course, disenchanted a lot of Salvadorans with democracy. And this is what the data is telling us in this particular 2 charts. This is the support for democracy in Latin America from a well-known opinion survey, the Latinobarometro. And the first one is from 2018, and the other one on the right is 2020. What it basically says is that the support for democracy in El Salvador was the lowest among all Latin American countries in 2018. You can see it's even lower than Guatemala, Honduras, and all the other countries, on the rest of the countries in 2018. It went up in 2020, probably or undoubtedly related to the president of Bukele and the expectations people are placing or were placing at the time on how Bukele was going to renew democracy and how democracy would probably attend to their needs and demands. This is the graph, just shows the tendency across 25 years or so. And you can see how the support for democracy starting in 2019, which is when Mauricio Funes comes to the presidency, went down, decreased until the year of the Bukele election in 2019. This is just another way of telling the story, but basically is the Latinobarometro asking people in the region, in the Latin American region, if they cared about or whether their government was democratic or not democratic. Well, guess what? El Salvador came on top of the countries in which the population really didn't care if their government was democratic or not democratic. And this particular chart is especially telling because it's, again, El Salvador right at the top, only below the Dominican Republic, saying that basically Salvadorians were willing to adopt an authoritarian form of government if this form of government would solve their problems. So this is a stage going up to the 2019 elections, where Bukele ran on basically a ticket of being different from the past, being different from the corruption of the past, of the last 30 years of corruption. This is the phrase he uses constantly, still uses. So renewing democracy, renewing everything, in fact. You see that the claims of this language are very vague. Well, if you go back to the actual documents and statements, the details are very vague. They're intentionally vague, of course. But the ticket is being different, or the claim is based on or the campaign is based on a claim that he will be different. He will break from the past and renew democracy. He will modernize the country. He doesn't say exactly how, but he also promises to fight corruption. He promises that money will be enough for public works, for social needs, because nobody will be stealing. And he also, by the way, also promises to strengthen US and Salvador relations, which in fact he did at the beginning, especially during the Trump administration. So once again, this is the setting, 30 years of war. Two parties basically used their 30 years for what I've shown you. A lot of lost opportunities during the way. This is the perfect backdrop of a candidacy that promises to be a disruptor of democracy. The candidate Bukele uses perfectly well this opportunity. It could have been Bukele, it could have been anybody else, but it was, in this particular case, a character that also, or additionally, connected very well. He had this very simple way of communicating with a general public who was willing to experiment something different from what the previous 30 years had offered. I skipped this particular graph on the right, which shows basically that Bukele won with a 53% majority of which is not a landslide, as happened just 2 years later with the legislative elections in El Salvador. Only 51% of voter participation, and 53 ended up voting for Bukele. 53% ended up voting for Bukele. I guess there were high hopes and expectations from the international community. The United States government was particularly enthusiastic about how the Bukele government opened opportunities for the renewal of democracy, for new social and economic progress in the country. There was also, I think, some enthusiasm from the business community in El Salvador. And I think in general, even to those who were critical of his practices during his previous political career, I think this opened up a space for hope, of opportunity for things to change in terms of democracy and the rights of Salvadorans being actually taken care of. But what happened very early on, as he started making decisions, it soon became clear that he had very little care for democratic practices or values. He basically cut off all forms of civic participation. There were no channels, no official channels for participation in public policy making. He also made accountability and government accountability and transparency recede. He was very intolerant right at the beginning with the press. He had already showed the signs when he was a mayor of the capital city. Maybe I'll do a note here. But Bukele started off his career as a member of the FMLN. And then for this very small town just outside San Salvador, and then ran as the mayor of the capital city, San Salvador. He got expelled in 2017 from the FMLN, and immediately, or he had previously been preparing his road to the presidency. I think from an outsider perspective, you would say that Bukele forced his expulsion from the party in 2017 to pave the way for his candidacy in 2019. Anyway, during his 2 terms in local government, he had already shown these signs of being intolerant to critics. He had shown also that he was willing to bend some rules to make things happen. He was also willing to involve family in government, in government issues. He was also willing to bend truth a little bit. And I think the traits accentuated as he became president. This is a story that I'm obviously oversimplifying in a few minutes, but pretty soon into his presidency, it was evident that he had a different way of doing things that was too close to an authoritarian view of power. And this leads up to February 2019. This is the picture on the right, where he storms the legislative palace with military troops, as you can see, and the police, to force the legislature to approve a loan he had been requesting for some time from the legislature to be approved. This was money to be used for his security plan, the Control Territorial plan. Of course, this events did not go unnoticed in the international press. This was a huge scandal behind it, and I think this is basically a coup that was not completed. What his language, his signs, and the events leading to this moment all signaled that what he was trying to do was to replace the legislature and legislate himself. This is outside the National Assembly, the picture on the left, while he's addressing a crowd that he had gathered outside, also to pressure the legislature to approve the loan agreement. And I think this is a milestone. The February 9th events of 2020 are a milestone in terms of a very quick road to the dismantling of democracy in El Salvador. And of course, I think this might come about as an exaggeration if you probably maybe lost track from what has happened between the election of Bukele in 2019 and now early 2022. We say dismantling of democracy this quickly, that can't be true. There has to be some hyperbole behind it. There has to be some exaggeration to it. Well, let me show you. These are a selection of other Twitter profile pictures from his own doing. You can see how the different topics he's interested in are projected into the pictures. 3 of them are related to the Bitcoin community, and the other one is more of how he sees himself in power for a long time, even into his older age days. Bukele, I think, belongs to a long tradition of authoritarian Latin American strong men, because there are always strong men and not women, who use power in this manner, bending the rules, having very little regard for the rule of law, for human rights. Of course, the 4 pictures tell very different stories, and I do not want to stereotype here with the 4 pictures, but there are clear linkages to the practices and the discourse even of these 4 people you see on the picture, particularly with Maduro and Ortega. He also had a close relationship initially with AMLO in Mexico. We don't know of any relationship with Bolsonaro, but some of his policies do evoke some of the hardliners in the Bolsonaro government. In terms of his language, if I would show you different quotes from some of his speeches, you couldn't distinguish some of the speeches from a hardliner on the right or a hardliner on the left. He has this very pragmatic use of political language that basically mimics whatever he needs to do in that particular moment in time. So I would say, and I'm using this slide just to argue and to point to the fact that this is not an isolated event in Latin America, and particularly the Bukele phenomenon is also related to the democratic backsliding in Latin America in the last few years. And I think, and this is what the little paragraph to announce this talk said, this might already be the latest autocracy in Latin America. In the Bukele administration might be the last of a sequence of autocracies in Latin America, with different expressions, different forms of exercising power, of course, and with clear differences, but very well related. And I would say the closest, if you would compare any of these four, you would say that Bukele is probably the most like Ortega and Rosario Murillo in Nicaragua. He has a taxable society, he has closed spaces for the press, he has decried against the United States, he has this anti-imperialistic language that is very close to what Ortega uses in Nicaragua. He has moved forward to replace the Constitutional Court. He has used the military as a basis of his popular support. He has used public resources in a manner that can only be explained in terms of political or electoral interests. And there's even coincidence in language with Ortega. And I think this is something worth noting because Bukele ran as a candidate for a right-wing party in El Salvador, a small right-wing party initially, and then he moved out to his own party, which he says is beyond left and right. He claims it's beyond left and right. This slide just wants to show you very briefly. I do not want to go into the fine details. We can discuss them later, but it basically shows how, starting in February 2020, which is when Bukele storms the parliament, there's a sequence of events that I think very well allows us to say or to state that he has effectively dismantled democracy. And I think this is a very bold statement, in particular in this context. In May 2021, the new legislature comes into power, where he has a supermajority. He wins, his party wins by a landslide in February 2021. In May 2021, they take office, and their first decisions are related to the sacking of the Constitutional Court and the Attorney General, and they are replaced with people loyal to Bukele. So this basically dismantles the Salvadorian system of checks and balances very early on this particular legislature. 2021, he expels the International Anti-Corruption Commission, the CC, as he himself had invited to the country with the help of the Organization of American States. He also elects a new cohort of justices to the Supreme Court. So now basically Bukele has named through his legislature, so through his parliament, 2/3 of all justices at the Supreme Court, including the most relevant, which are sitting in the Constitutional Court. In August 2021, he sacks 1/3 of all judges in the country. And of course, this is the complete takeover of the judiciary. There are reports of judges being pressured to rule in favor of some of the interests of the government. There's a clear leaning of a certain part of the judiciary in favor of the government. And the August 2021 events signaled the end of the judicial independence in El Salvador, institutional judicial independence. In 2021, the same Supreme Court chamber, which is our constitutional court, rules against 6 very clear constitutional articles that it is okay for a sitting president to run for re-election, something that our constitutions have prohibited for the last 150 years or more. The first constitution, the first Salvadoran constitution in 1841 expressly prohibited re-election. And ever since, our constitutions have this text written in them prohibiting successive or successive re-election by the president. So against 6 different articles of the Constitution, against any logic, but of course very in sync with the power graph that is going on right now, the Constitutional Court rules that it is okay for basically Bukele to run again in 2024. In November, just 2 or 3 months ago, he also has this new legal framework drafted by his legislature, which basically subtracts powers from the local governments. And in 2021, he names the new Attorney General, which is actually re-elects the Attorney General he had placed in May 2021 on a temporary basis. This basically eliminates all checks and balances in terms of executive power in El Salvador. What is remaining are either too weak or have been silenced by fear or intimidation. And the remaining checks are in terms of stopping key decisions in government ineffective, clearly ineffective. And probably you could name 1 or 2 which are still in place, but are simply insignificant in terms of what Bukele now can do after having concentrated legislative, judiciary, even local government, or even local powers into his hands, in his circle. I think a note of something worth noting is that the Bukele government runs under a structure of 2 parallel cabinets. This is what the media has reported, and I think it's really interesting to notice at this point. He has this formal cabinet, the Minister of Health and the Minister of Education and the Minister of Security, but on top of the formal cabinet, there's an informal cabinet run mostly by Venezuelan nationals, which are his executive branch, in fact, that through which he gives instructions and guidelines to his ministers and the rest of the government. This, of course, is a cabinet in the shadows. They have no official post in government, but have been identified by the media as being basically the executive arm of Bukele in government, along with his brothers, who also help him run the country. The Venezuelan nationals, by the way, are very close, paradoxically, not to the Maduro government, but are actually very close to the opposition, particularly close to Leopoldo López, his party and his close allies. But it's not only institutions. This is not the end of the story. Bukele has also gone on to other expressions of this variant of authoritarianism, and I think one that's pretty telling of what's going on in the country is his pact, his deal, or the deal that his government has reached with the gangs in El Salvador to reduce homicides in exchange of electoral support, in exchange of electoral support and money. Bukele has basically reduced, or the government has reduced the historically high homicide rate in El Salvador from a record high in 2015. The rate was decreasing already, but the lowest homicide rate in El Salvador in over 20 years has been during the Bukele administration. And this can only be explained because something else has changed the dynamics of gang activity. Gangs are still there. They are very powerful. They are in fact now political actors, particularly in local governments. They have control of certain areas of territory. They get to decide in local issues. They have an industry of extortion well placed and running. This has been very well documented. But homicides, which is the most salient of all indicators, you would argue, in terms of the status of security in a country, have reduced dramatically. And the explanation, this is what the media has found out, independent journalists has found out, is that behind this, there's a deal of Bukele with the two principal gangs, the two main gangs in El Salvador, DMS 13 and the 18th Street. You can see here on the picture, this is a picture that the Bukele government, I'm sorry. This is a picture the Bukele government published during the pandemic, and this is the treatment of prisoners in a Salvadorian prison. You can see them. This of course was a picture that provoked a number of reactions from international human rights groups and national domestic human rights groups, because basically people here are being treated as animals, as you can see there for the picture. There are a number of pictures like this, official pictures taken by the government. But the truth behind this is that there's actually probably been a truce or a deal going on for quite some time now, even when this picture was taken. There is no evidence, hard evidence, letting us conclude if the deal is still going on, although the homicide rates are still very low. This does not mean the end of gang activity, of course. Extortion is still going on. People are disappearing, and other forms of crime-related, other forms of gang-related crime is still going on too. I think this is, I think, a very worrying chapter of the Bukele administration, and I hope we can discuss it later. Another clear example of this declining form of democracy in El Salvador is how corruption has gone unchecked in the country in the last few years. These are pictures of the front pages of two of the main Salvadoran newspapers, La Prensa Gráfica and El Día de Hoy, relating to how, on the right, how on the left, I'm sorry, is how the United States is accusing all these people, these pictures of people there, of people being involved with high-level corruption cases. This would be interesting by itself, but if you look closely, this is the chief of cabinet. These are two ministers of the Bukele administration. This is the head legal advisor to the president. This is one of his unofficial spokesperson. This is the head of prisons. This is a couple of former ministers, and these are two political and financial, probably, allies as well on the left. And they were included by the United States government in a list, the Engel list, which basically accuses them of being involved in corruption cases or high-level corruption cases and of dismantling democracy. This, you would say, would rattle a government, right? In other times in El Salvador, surely this would have been a major event and would probably have reshuffled a policy decisions in the country. On the contrary, this meant that the Bukele government intensified his rhetoric against the United States, accusing the United States of imperialism, accusing the United States of mingling in internal affairs of El Salvador. The other front page is another American government list, the Global Magnitsky list, which accuses these two persons here, the vice minister of security and head of prisons, and the other one is a high-level official who have been related to the pact that for the United States government is a fact, the pact with the gangs that for the United States government is also a fact. So there's not only apparently journalistic evidence, there's also hard evidence that has even reached high levels of the American government, who are now claiming that these two persons have been involved in the agreement with the gangs. Another, I think, very distinct trait of this form of authoritarianism is the massive use of disinformation through a very complex and by far spontaneous arrangement of media outlets, including some official outlets, like the one on the left, which is the newspaper created by the Bukele administration, Diario El Salvador. And you read this newspaper every day, and it tells obviously a completely different story from what independent media is reporting on the country. This has been distributed freely around the country, has been paid with public funds, of course, with very little or no accountability and transparency. Along the official media outlets, which include also a TV channel and radio stations, there's another complex network of radios that are very close to the government and internet trolls and bots, especially on Twitter and Facebook, who are constantly reproducing the message of the Bukele government. And you can see it everywhere. If you are a Salvadoran living in the United States, part of the diaspora, of the Salvadoran diaspora, you are also being catered by this large network of disinformation coming out from the Bukele government. The network is so complex, it is so powerful that it is even attacking US legislators. It's trying to subvert the support for US legislators who are criticizing and accusing Bukele of dismantling democracy. You can read in the media, for example, the case of Congresswoman Norma Torres, where the Bukele or the government-related bot and troll farms are attacking her political support bases in the United States. No, not here, I mean. They're this powerful and this well organized. Of course, this is the massive use of public resources to put out the message of Bukele everywhere you look at. And this is on Twitter, this is on Facebook, this is on YouTube. There are hundreds of YouTube channels that focus on the Bukele character, figure, and decisions. There are even channels that are relating his figure to religious messages and how he might be the anointed, how he might be a second coming. I know this might sound absurd and something difficult to believe, but look it up yourself and you'll find these channels that are hard to believe and are part of a very well-greased disinformation machinery going on around the country. This has also, how how are we with the time? Oh, I'm already very close to my time limit. So let me close pretty soon. There's also been a constrainment of the civic space, I think, which is very significant to notice. This is a demonstration in San Salvador. I think this is the September 15 demonstration in Salvador on the left. And on the right, you see police controls stopping buses of people coming into the city who were coming to the demonstration. And they would stop the buses to actually stop people from going to the demonstration. This is very well documented by media too. This hadn't happened in El Salvador in over 30 years, using the police for political control objectives. Last year, the government also tried to pass a foreign agents law, which was rejected by the larger international community, and of course by domestic organizations and citizens. The act was not passed, but still there in Congress. It is being used as a permanent threat, and it might come out anytime in the near future. The act basically would impede civil society organizations like DTJ, the organization I belong to function in the country, because we receive international funding. Any form of international funding would be cut, would be prohibited. It would also mean very stringent regulation, even for organizations that are not receiving international funding in the country. There's also been, you've probably seen it in the news, spying on journalists and civil society organizations. Benjamin was referencing it at the beginning of the talk during his presentation. A number of people in the country, 32 have been officially reported, but we know that there are a lot more, have been targeted, particularly with Pegasus, an Israeli malware that infects your phone and basically allows for the attacker to compromise every and all communication in your phone, communication, document, picture, and anything that you have on your phone in real time. They can also download, extract everything you have on your phone. So it's basically like having spies on your back 24/7 for who knows how long. This has, after some pressure, prompted the Attorney General's office, which you have to remember was appointed by the Bukele legislature, to say he's going to investigate what is going on. The report from the independent organizations that proved that there was hacking on these 35 phones basically says that while there is no concluding definite evidence, hard evidence that this was a doing of the Salvadoran government, everything leads to the doorsteps of the Salvadoran government or an agent acting on behalf of the Salvadoran government. You have to take into account that the targets were journalists who are critical or who have a critical line to the Bukele government, who are independent media. You have to take into account that also civil society organizations who are critical to the Bukele government were targeted. This is just a screenshot from the message, the warning I received from Apple saying that my phone had been compromised by state-sponsored attackers because of who you are or what you do. There has also been targeted legislative committees going on to exhibit and persecute members of civil society organizations, tax and labor targeted auditing. There has been a recent Digital Crimes Act amendments that will allow, with a new act that was just passed yesterday, phone espionage from the government. Basically, some media reporting this as legalizing Pegasus, the use of Pegasus in phones of Salvadorans. And also passed yesterday, the undercover digital agents law that would basically allow spies anywhere and using any technology they can to spy on opposition and dissenters. This is also another sign of the times, the freedom of the press. I've already referenced this. I'm sorry, I'm trying to to speed up just to leave some space for questions and answers at the end. This is Tucker Carlson, by the way, interviewing the president. He never gives interviews to the domestic press, but he did agree to an interview to Tucker Carlson. He was laughing himself off there with the president. So is he the coolest dictator in the world? Well, apparently people still believe he is. This is from a recent poll from Fundación. 61% of Salvadorans believe that it's okay for a strong leader in government and that they want a strong leader in government, even if he violates rules to accomplish things. And this is the popularity thermometer of Bukele. And as you can see, it's not very different from what his popularity was in December 2019 to December 2021. Also from Fundación. And what this is saying is that whatever he has done in terms of democracy is not interfering with the support he's receiving from the general public in El Salvador. What's ahead? Well, he's about to amend the constitution. It's basically a new constitution. He doesn't need it to run for re-election because the court has already ruled he can. And this is what I see very briefly ahead. A fiscal and economic crisis because there's very little margin for maneuver in terms of financing, an erratic public policy led by his need for international funding, the increased unrest and mobilization of society, probably some internal dissidence from his coalition, some increased repression. Now he has even digital tools to do it. And of course, he's moving, he knows how the only remaining space, institutional space, are the elections. So the government is moving to take control also of that in the near future. And of course, what we expect is that he will cling to power after 2024. I am sorry I had to speed up at the end, but I did want to leave some space for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
I'm going to just take the chair. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative here and ask you a little bit more about my favorite topic, which is, gangs and criminal violence. And, I want to note that in sort of the kinds of things that I study, organized crime, corruption, organized violence in Latin America, the case of El Salvador stands out along several dimensions. Perhaps it's probably the only example, it's certainly the starkest example of a country where there was an open truce with organized criminal organizations. For the Mata truce in 2011, the government at the time, FMLN government at the time, sort of initially denied being involved in this Mata truce that dramatically reduced homicides, but eventually came out. Not only were they involved, that it had been in many ways the brainchild of the government. That's already, a wild story in its own right. Other times, there's lots of examples across Latin America of radical drops in homicides, but the typical government response is to just remain in denial that it had anything to do with orchestrating such a truce or anything like that. But the story continues where, in El Salvador over the years, the truce sort of collapsed and everyone who was involved in the truce, sort of had their name tarnished by it. The FMLN ended up winning the following presidency at Seren, but he ran on sort of a platform of denouncing the previous FMLN president's involvement in the truce. And Bukele really ramped that up to the next level where, or correct me if I'm wrong, and this is really my outsider's perspective, but I see Bukele as like taking the next step in that vilification of the Mara truce by going after President Funes and other, basically every official who had anything to do with this truce is either under arrest or there's an arrest warrant, or in other ways is now considered a criminal for having in any way contributed to this truce among the Mara, the MS-13 and the Barrio de Socho. to reduce violence, right? And so it's not just that Bukele has a secret pact with the Maras, right? It's that he has publicly vilified the very idea of any kind of pact to reduce violence, of anything less than the most brutal treatment of the Maras. And so he's out there tweeting these pictures of the Maras. I'm going to put them all together in the same prison cells, which should lead to a massacre. But I'm going to be so brutal with them and so humiliate them and degrade them that they won't even be able to kill each other. And the sort of incredibly violent and repressive approach on the outside or public facing face of his policy. And then all of a sudden in December, it's revealed actually he's negotiating with the Maras. And actually, it's a kind of, how does his public opinion survive this? How are people on the ground just saying he's a hypocrite, he's a liar, or is there sort of a common sense understanding? No, of course, everybody negotiates with the Maras. They say this or they say that. I'm having a hard time understanding what is the current state of what I see as the moral vilification of the idea of pacting with criminals in a context where Bukele continues to have such high popularity ratings, and this, the U.S. government has confirmed his involvement in a negotiating with criminal groups.
Yes, no, you described very well what has happened with the vilification of the previous FMLN truce with the gangs, 2011, 2012. And yes, at this moment in time, I think there's some cognitive dissonance in Salvadorans in terms of what they're seeing that this government is doing against those who participated in any kind, in any form, in any respect, in regard to that particular truce, and what the evidence is showing from independent media. And this is, I think, part of the story. I think this is a hard question to answer, but I think this is one part of the story, and this might be several pieces to it. One part is that there's a disinformation machinery going on, and they are presenting those who participated in the 2011 truce with the gangs as actual criminals, equivalent to criminals, and they are targeting the general public as presenting that as something that happened only because the ruling parties at that moment allowed it, and that the behavior is equivalent to a crime. And I think they have been very effective and successful in doing that. And that what is being reported right now by media is only fake news. They're not saying that they are dealing with the gangs. They are not accepting yet that they are dealing with the gangs. They're not acknowledging that there is a truce going on. They are presenting themselves as being a target of a fake news campaign by independent media. And that there is an interest of linking their government to the vices of the past. And this can only come from interests that are obviously against the government of Bukele. I think that's part of the story. So yes, you would ask, and I have had a slide, but that's too much, that shows that only, same study by Fundación, by the way, that the study shows, I'd be wrong about the study, but it shows that only 20% of Salvadorans believe there's a truce going on. That's a very significant number. Only 20% believe there's a truce going on. And the other 60 point something, these are a part of the population that doesn't really care, but 60% and over think that the reduction of homicides in the country, it's because of the successes of the Bukele security plan. This is what they're saying. This is what they're thinking. And this can only come from this information, from a machinery well-greased to project a very different image of what's going on in the country.
Great answer. Okay, I'm going to read a couple of questions from the Q&A. I think we go technically just up until 150. Yeah, 150. But if you go over, it's okay. People may have to leave. So I want to make sure I get the questions out there. First from Kevin Cromash, who is the executive director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, a co-sponsor of the event, who I forgot to thank at the outset. Kevin says, very clear and illuminating discussion. Thank you very much. You've touched on attacks on most of the major institutions that normally serve as checks on executive power: legislature, judiciary, media, and so on. Are there any institutions that still present any notable resistance to the executive, such as federal agencies, religious organizations, trade unions, or others? I want to ask two more quick questions that came up in the Q&A, and if we have time, we can circle back and get a couple others, but I thought these were important. One from an anonymous attendee just asked, what do you do to protect yourself from attacks from the Salvadorian government? I thought that was an interesting question. And let's see, one more question I had here. The panorama, this is from Fernando Forantini. The panorama painted in this great exposition shows deep ties with shady, violent organizations, gangs, internet militias, corruption with politicians, judges, army, and police. Can we say that his cryptocurrency adoption, beyond his disclosure, beyond his discourse, serves a more sinister, less transparent objective, but extremely pragmatic for his purposes? I think the implication of this question being some sort of criminal or shady economic dealings, or perhaps turning El Salvador into some kind of haven for those sorts of financial transactions. So that's your lightning round, 3 questions there.
Sure, thank you. Great questions. On the first one, which refers to if there are any remaining checks on his power. Well, yes, civil society, if you can call that a check on his power, right? And independent media. I don't think we could have known any of this or most of this without independent media in the country right now. What I've told you right now about the truths, about the corruption in government, about his dealings with the crypto business are all from independent Salvadorian media. And I think that's why he hates, despises so much independent media. And the attacks are increasing over time and in intensity too, as well as civil society, organized civil society. I mean, gradually, and this has started happening probably around September of last year, other social sectors are also expressing their rejection of the Bukele decisions. Religious leaders have appeared, who have been attacked, by the way, by the Bukele government and the Bukele support base. But there are some very clear leadership from the religious establishment too that are now expressly and openly showing their rejection of the Bukele decisions. I would say that's about what's remaining right now. So it's journalism and civil society. There is, and this is very important right now, very little organization going on in terms of cohesion of this rejection of the Bukele government. Not only because the popularity and the support for Bukele is still very high, as you saw from the data, but also because the dissent against Bukele is coming from very different social sectors. And I think we're still having a difficult time in organizing and somehow rallying around a very clear agenda that will hopefully help reestablish democracy in El Salvador. The second one is, what do I do in terms of personal protection? Well, it's a tough one. I still use the hacked phone, by the way. This is the hacked phone because apparently from what I hear from specialists, it doesn't really matter if I throw away my phone. It's just I've taken obviously some precautions that you take when things like this happen. But if I change phone, I might be hacked tomorrow with a different phone. And so basically, I take the precautions for my own security that I think many Salvadorans also take during their daily lives. In terms of the corruption, authoritarianism relationship, I think you touched on a key point. And this, we don't have enough information yet, but I would guess my intuition is that data is leading us, evidence is leading us to conclude that the later forms, expression of authoritarianism from the Bukele government are aimed at covering for some of the corruption cases going on, and that we haven't heard the last word on this. So this is a vicious circle, right? Which started first, if the high-level corruption cases, or was it first just a matter of a power grab? And the power grab seems now to be instrumental to covering up for the corruption going on in government. Take into account, please, that the Bukele government has already full control since May 2021 of the Attorney General's office, which has not prosecuted a single public government official from the Bukele administration accused of any corruption. And you see, for example, I think the very emblematic case of the prisons director and Vice Minister of Security, who has been involved in 3 different corruption cases, and he is still in office. And the government is actually protecting him. And the Bukele government is willing to risk the status of the relationship of El Salvador with the United States over protecting these officials who have been accused of corruption. If you notice the lists, and this is a very interesting fact, if you notice the characters around the lists that the American government has issued in terms of corruption cases and dismantling democracy, there's nowhere in the list where Bukele appears, right? But he's actually at the top of the list, right? Without being there. This is the legal advisor. This is the chief of staff or the head of cabinet. These are 2 ministers, former ministers. They are talking about Bukele. It's obviously that the roads are leading to Bukele.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple more things real quickly in the last couple, and then we'll stop at 2 sharp. Let's see here. So, get Mike. One question was just how many Chivo users are there?
How many?
I was curious. How many Chivo users are there? I think Chivo is the app or something about the
it's the crypto wallet.
Let's see. Another question had to do with well, I guess I'd like to sort of join together a couple of questions that came up and ask this question about and sort of ask a question about how do you see this? What can be done? What besides journalists continuing to fight the good fight and civil society continuing to fight the good fight. When I look at Brazil, I'm actually made hopeful by the sort of the developments over the last few months. I still think there's a lot of risks, but I just see a lower approval rating for Bolsonaro. I see that hardcore base still backing him, but I don't see that widespread support. I don't see him winning an election that would be held tomorrow. Similarly to sort of Trump, not being able to muster the kind of popular support and really, having to resort to these sort of extreme measures that ended up not actually working to keep him in power. Is there any positive sort of actions that could be taken or developments that could happen? What do you see on the horizon? Are there ways of reaching those 80% of Salvadorans who seem to believe the disinformation and don't seek out these alternative sources of information? Particularly given what seems like some of the things you highlighted. Bukele being a bit rogue, sort of having in many ways run up against opposition from the U.S. Are there any sources of leverage that you see moving forward that can make the next presidential elections at least democratic, at least a world where there's sort of, maybe he wins as a populist, but as he won before, but maybe it's at least a fair election or something like that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to divide the question in two. If the elections were to be tomorrow, Bukele would win. I have no doubt of that. He would win in a landslide. In fact, in a clean election, he would win. But I think he's also taking precautions, and he's poised to arrange the wave to make sure that if he does not have the support in 2024, he will win anyways. And I've described some of the issues that are going on, the constitutional court ruling, the new constitution, the takeover of the electoral authority. There are very worrying signs that there is already influence from the executive on the electoral authority. So obviously he's positioning towards making sure that if he doesn't have the popular support in 2024, somehow he will be the winner of the election. He's also opening up avenues for the vote from the diaspora. And this is very important, and I think it relates to the second part of the question. You must know that El Salvador has almost a third of the population, probably a little bit less, living in the United States. There's almost 3 million Salvadorans in the United States, and a huge population over there. And they have a weight in what their relatives over here think and decide in terms of politics. And in fact, the diaspora, group of, or part of the leadership of the diaspora in the States, were very instrumental in terms of launching the candidacy of Bukele back in 2018, 2017, 19. This is starting to change, and I think this is one of the things that are very important in terms of what can be done. The opinion, even from those hard-lined supporters of Bukele, would give their life to Bukele in 2018, is now not so enthusiastic, and some are definitely now openly against him, and I think this will eventually percolate to the more general population living in the United States. And so this is one thing that can be done, which is speaking to a Salvadorian audience in the States, in their language, in their forums, in their media outlets. And this is, I think, one very influential thing that can be done. And this might take resources, it might take time, but although there's no hard evidence, there's a lot of evidence leading to conclude that there's a big weight on the political opinion of Salvadorans living here from the political opinion of Salvadorans living in the States, because of the influence they exercise through remittances, and the fact that they live outside and closer to the United States, or in the United States. That's one thing. The other one is like the easiest and fastest way, I think, is also influencing over his financial margins. The margins of financial maneuvering he has right now. The government is cash-strapped, and he's seeking an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, which would give him around $14,000 million in the short term. Not only important because of the money, the actual money that's going to come from this, but also because this will reduce the country risk and would make the country also able to open other loan avenues with other actors, other international financial institutions, or even private lenders. So it's important for the credibility of the repayment opportunities of the country to get this agreement from the IMF. He has been very unsuccessful in doing so, and the agreement was supposed to be drafted and signed last year. There has been a lot of resistance from the IMF, and the latest report from the IMF basically is recommending Bukele to drop Bitcoin. You saw it from one of my slides. He's resisting, of course, by all means, but and looking for alternative funding. He has recently been in Turkey. They're posing with Erdogan, and he's now joining also the Andean Financial Association, which might give him also some margin to maneuver for at least for a few months. But I think that's a key issue right now. The limits of populism in El Salvador are how much he can finance, and this is not a rich country in natural resources, right? So eventually he will run out of money to finance his handouts, to finance the promotion of his self-image. He will run out of money, of resources, to continue doing what he's doing. And this will put him in a very tight spot. This will probably happen later on in his president, third or fourth year in office. But by now, he would have also moved to secure that the electoral rules and the electoral dynamics also favor him towards 2024. In any case, we are very clear that the financial aspect of the whole presidency is a big hazard to him, and I think that's something very important that can be done from the international community, which is pressuring for democratic clauses to be included, democratic conditions to be included in these loans, and for businesses not to do business with an authoritarian like him.
Well, Jose, thank you very much for your comments. I have to say that last that prognosis, it sounds absolutely sound, but it just can't help make me think of a long history of situations in Latin America where in the IMF and international financial institutions have been on perhaps the wrong side of sort of democracy versus more authoritarian governments. And so it would be, it would in a sense be refreshing and in some ways ironic if that was the path forward for pressuring, the resilience of democratic institutions in El Salvador. But, it's the kind of new world that we live in, I suppose. Certainly with, some of the comments in the chat, when you get a chance, to look, it's also been an interesting conversation going on there. And certainly with issues around, especially China, but also Russia, having their part in sort of backing and giving moral support to authoritarian governments around the world. I think it's an interesting time for sort of the Western financial institutions to be taking a different sort of role. Well,
Absolutely,
I want to thank you very much for really incredible presentation. It was extremely informative and very in depth, and really covered a wide range of topics. And I want to thank our audience for sticking with us. I see very few of you dropped out, so I think that's a good sign. Please visit the class website, join us in our ongoing series, both the current event series, our regular series of all manner of scholars and researchers, journalists, and artists here at Center for Latin American Studies, and next week's talk on democratic threats to democracy in Brazil. Thanks again, Jose. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks to Kevin for co-sponsoring. I also want to thank David Holliday for putting me in touch with Jose. And everyone, have a great week.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.